Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Me with Mr. Shepard. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Could you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Thank you, Robbie. It's good to be on your program. I am probably among the foremost authorities on one subject, and that's Richard Nixon and Watergate. I lived through it as a member of his White House staff, and then I've pursued it pretty much as an obsession for the last 15 years. So what if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you how I got to the White House staff, which I of course find interesting, and then a summary of Watergate, so your listeners will have some idea of what we're talking about. I grew up, born and raised in Southern California, mainly in Orange County, in rural Orange County, on this Spanish land grant called Irvine Ranch, and went to public schools except for Whittier. Whittier is a gentle Quaker school in the foothills of Los Angeles, and it's not particularly distinguished, except Richard Nixon went there and was very proud to have been a graduate of Whittier. And when I was a student there, I won the Richard Nixon Scholarship in 1965. He had been vice president under Dwight Eisenhower for 8 years, had lost in a close race to Jack Kennedy for president, and then had gone east to practice law. But I won the scholarship in his name, and the dean said, go to this lunch, and the fine Republican ladies of Whittier will give you $250 cash. So I went. And to everybody's surprise, so did Dick Nixon. So he'd left politics, but he loved the school. And we sat next to each other at lunch, had a nice conversation, and then he went back to New York, and I went back to college. And the scholarship dean called me 2 weeks later and said, you must have made a heck of an impression on the former vice president. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, he doubled your scholarship. He sent his personal check for another $250. So I felt pretty good about it. Money was scarce. Then I went off to law school, and he went off and became president of the United States. So we ask ourselves at age 24, how many presidents did you know? Yeah, of course, I didn't meet him through importance or anything. It was fluke. But I told all my friends at law school that if he won, I'd go to Washington and go help. And there was this program that I discovered called White House Fellowships. And if you won, you got to spend a year in Washington studying the federal government. And they had a lot of people apply, and they got it down to about 15 each year to come and be assigned to a cabinet department. And I'm pretty articulate, I'm pretty forceful, I interview well. But out of 1,000 applicants, nobody else had a personal scholarship from the newly elected president. So I won. I like to think I won on the merits, but you take it where you can get it. So I went to Washington. I was selected to be a White House fellow 2 weeks after I graduated from law school. So I show up, I'm 24 years old. I got assigned to Treasury. And then at the end of my year as a fellow, I was hired onto Nixon's White House staff in a permanent position, the domestic counsel. And we created it under Nixon, but it's the counterpart of the National Security Council. It staffs the president on public policy initiatives. And it was John Ehrlichman's staff. I was probably the first outside hire onto the newly created domestic council. And I stayed 5 years. And toward the end, I also functioned as deputy counsel on President Nixon's Watergate defense team. I transcribed the tapes. I ran the document rooms holding the seized files. I knew everybody involved. And it ended very badly. You know, President Nixon resigned in disgrace, and 24 members of his administration went to jail. So I got there young. I lived a long time through it. I knew everybody. And I left after it was over, left Washington, came to Philadelphia, started practicing corporate law. And then about 15 years ago, I decided to take another look and see why we lost so badly, why it was such a wipeout. You might say I'm a sore loser. And that's what's going to get us into our story. But let me pause there, because now I'm pretty knowledgeable about Watergate, not about much else, but I'm pretty knowledgeable about Watergate. And I'd like to summarize for your viewers what really is meant by that scandal. And with respect, I'm going to read a paper I wrote within the last 3 weeks that summarizes a 2.5-year scandal. So if you will bear with me, we'll go through this. What we refer to as the unrest of the 1960s really refers to the 20-year period between 1960 and 1980, when there were 3 assassinations: President Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Senator Robert Kennedy. There were riots in some 19 major cities. Prestigious universities were shut down by student protests, both against racism and against the Vietnam War. And no president completed 2 full terms in office. Jack Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson chose not to run for a second term. Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace. Jerry Ford was never elected at all. And Jimmy Carter was defeated after 1 term by Ronald Reagan. Now, Nixon had won in 1968 by promising to end the Vietnam War and to restore law and order to a nation torn apart by dissent. There were 537,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam when Nixon assumed office, and it had declined to just 250 when he ran for re-election in 1972. He had a series of foreign policy successes in his first term, including the opening to China, détente with the Soviet Union, ending the Vietnam War, and the Paris Peace Accords, and reasserting America's influence in the Middle East, including saving Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Domestically, he was also successful. He'd founded the Environmental Protection Agency, passed the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, peacefully desegregated the Southern schools, restored the rights of Native Americans, ended the draft, enacted the 18-year-old vote, and quadrupled the number of women serving in senior government positions. Now, his opponent in 1972 was Senator George McGovern of Dakota, who ran as an unapologetic progressive. That was the word he used, progressive. He promised to raise taxes to pay for promised programs. His opponent characterized his campaign as being in favor of acid, amnesty, and abortion. Acid was the scourge of psychedelic drugs, LSD in particular, affecting America's college youth. You may remember Harvard professor Timothy Leary urged his students to tune in, turn on, and drop out. Amnesty was forgiveness for all the draft dodgers and deserters and miscreants who had so vigorously opposed the Vietnam War. And there were thousands of them. And they didn't just want to be pardoned, which McGovern was happy to agree to. They wanted to be told they'd been right all along in opposing the war. And abortion was roughly the same issue as we find ourselves in today. An intense state-by-state battle, because Roe v. Wade wasn't decided until the beginning of the following year. The 72 election was a wipeout. Nixon won in the greatest electoral landslide in our nation's history, 61% of the vote, and won every state except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. 22 months later, Nixon resigned in disgrace, and 24 members of administration were convicted and imprisoned in the greatest political scandal of the 20th century. Now, Watergate had burst into public view on June 17, 1972. That would be 50 years ago, a couple of months ago. 5 burglars were caught red-handed in the Watergate offices of the Democrat National Committee. They had cameras and bugging devices, and one of them worked for President Nixon's reelection committee, and others had phone numbers and uncirculated $100 bills traceable to the Nixon White House. The seeds of the scandal had been planted the year before. The Pentagon Papers, a secret Defense Department study of how we got into the Vietnam War in the first place, was leaked to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other major newspapers by anti-war activist Daniel Ellsberg. It was considered the biggest national security leak since the beginning of the Cold War, and Nixon authorized creation of a special investigations unit within the White House itself. This unit was nicknamed the Plumbers because their job was to prevent leaks. The problem with Ellsberg, though, was he was also a consultant to the RAND Corporation, a defense think tank in Santa Monica. And through his work there, he had access to 54,000 other classified documents. The Plumbers decided to have a secret look at any Ellsberg files kept by his psychiatrist, Dr. Lewis Fielding. They committed an illicit entry over Labor Day in 1971, and it was planned by the 2 top plumbers, Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt. And it was actually conducted by several Cuban Americans. And it had been authorized by presidential assistant John Ehrlichman himself. In and of itself, the Fielding break-in was not directly connected to Watergate. But that very same team, Cuban Americans directed by Liddy and Hunt, conducted the Watergate break-in 10 months later. Except this time they got caught red-handed. So there really was a break-in, and there really was a cover-up. The issue then, and still today, is who else knew? Or as Senator Howard Baker put it so bluntly, what did the president know, and when did he know it? Now, in the great scheme of things, there are really 6 major players in Watergate. There's Nixon's senior staff. John Mitchell, who was his attorney general and head of his election campaign, Bob Haldeman, who was Nixon's chief of staff, and John Ehrlichman, who ran his domestic affairs. He was his first counsel to the president, and then headed domestic affairs, where he was my boss. The people who really got their hands dirty, the actual crooks or soldiers, if you will, were mid-level people. Gordon Liddy was a former FBI agent. He masterminded the Plumbers field-in break-in, and then he was chosen by John Dean to develop a campaign intelligence plan, which culminated in the Watergate break-in. Liddy served 5 years in jail for his many crimes. Jeb Magruder was a mid-level staffer sent early to the reelection committee to get things running while they waited for John Mitchell to come over from the Department of Justice. Magruder is the one who insisted that Liddy's plan was so expensive, he'd been promised, he felt, $1 million for this campaign intelligence plan. And Magruder said, well, the only person who can approve that kind of expenditure is John Mitchell, and he hasn't arrived yet. So they trooped over to the Department of Justice and presented this plan. Now, the plan was really off the wall, and there's no question what the plan was. Liddy wrote about it in his later autobiography. It included proposals for mugging, bugging, kidnapping, and prostitution. Now, the other person who went to that meeting, there were 4 people at the meeting: John Mitchell, Gordon Liddy, Jeb Magruder, and John Dean, because John Dean had recruited Liddy to develop this plan. Now, the Watergate unfolds over 2.5 years. So what happened is that Nixon's top people were convicted in the Watergate cover-up trial. They were sentenced 2.5 to 8 years, and each of them served 18 months. And Nixon himself resigned in disgrace, and 21 other members of the administration also did prison time. And their matters stood, as of the end of 1974, for 40 years. But what's happened is that over the past 8 years, since 2013, 4 batches of internal prosecution documents have surfaced. And it's those documents that I've uncovered that I maintain changes everything we've been told about Watergate. You see, Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski took his confidential Watergate files with him when he went back to Texas in 1974. And then after he died, they went to his alma mater, Baylor Law School in Waco, Texas, and they were retrieved by the National Archives in 2013, where I was the first to see them. Associate Special Prosecutor James Borenberg, who taught criminal law at Harvard Law School, took his files with him when he went back to Harvard, and they surfaced after he had died in 2015, and I was again the first to gain access. And counsel to the special prosecutor, Philip Lacavara, took his files when he resigned, and he didn't give them to the archives until 2020. And that's just 2 years ago. And once again, I was the first to get to go through them. And finally, there's this prosecutor's report, a secret sealed report that was said to establish Nixon's guilt. It was called the Roadmap. And it was the basis for the grand jury naming Nixon a co-conspirator in the cover-up, and for the House Judiciary Committee recommending Nixon's impeachment. Now, this document remained sealed until 2018. That's only 5 years ago, when it was finally released in response to my court petition. Now, I'm almost through, so bear with me for just a couple more minutes. What I believe these documents show is that Watergate turns out to be a situation where all 3 branches of government secretly coordinated their efforts to drive Nixon from office. And this included secret meetings between the prosecutors and the Watergate judges, secret meetings between the prosecutors and members of Congress and congressional staff, and secret meetings, secret memos, secret coordination, even reaching into the DC circuit. One additional point, if I could, all of this is covered in a recent symposium sponsored by the Federalist Society. And if you go on their website and look up Watergate, you'll find a posting not just to the session, a panel of distinguished lawyers and judges and practitioners discussing these documents I've uncovered, but you'll also find links to the documents themselves. So if you're still with us, that's a summary of Watergate and a summary of how I got there, how I lived through it. I mean, it's like surviving a forest fire. All these good friends, people I really looked up to and respected, they all went off to jail. And I walked free, but I think I'm a sore loser, Robbie, because I've uncovered all this stuff, and I think it changes the story.
When it comes to the secret meetings, could you give me a couple examples of the extent of those secret meetings? You mentioned with judges from the prosecutors and the judges at Watergate, but then you also mentioned Congress as well too. I'm just curious to what examples are of some of these secret meetings. Who was involved in these secret meetings?
Sure.
So that's
There,
perjury.
I can document, I have written proof of at least a dozen secret meetings between Watergate prosecutors and judges in the Watergate trials. Now, you don't have to have graduated from law school to realize that isn't kosher. That's not the way the system's supposed to be done. But there are these memos, and you don't know which is the greater surprise, that they were meeting with the judges in secret in advance of the trials, or that they left a paper trail. Now, I don't happen to have them with me, but they're posted on my website. And I'll just describe a couple of them to you. There's this letter dated December 27th, 1973, and it's to Judge Sirica. And the first sentence says, when Messrs. Ruth, Lacavara, Benvenisti, and I met with you at your request on December 14th. That's the first sentence of the letter. And those four people are the top four Watergate prosecutors. So it's not a question of whether there was an ex parte meeting. Oh, and as the letter points out, another judge was also in the same meeting. It wasn't just Judge John Sirica, it was also Judge Gerhard Gazelle, and he handles the other Watergate trials. So you have one written proof of four prosecutors meeting with two judges who are going to try the Watergate trials. Then there's a memo written by Phil Lacavara, who's counsel to the special prosecutor, saying, look, the decision's been made not to indict Nixon because the law is unclear as to whether you can indict a sitting president. So we've decided to let the House Judiciary Committee proceed with their impeachment. But we've got all this evidence that we gathered looking forward to a criminal prosecution. And we really ought to get it to the Hill to help them. But grand jury stuff is supposed to be secret. So we've got an idea on how to justify taking secret grand jury material gathered for a different purpose and sharing it with the Hill. But it's so creative that if we spring it on Judge Sirica, he might reject it out of hand because it's a pretty aggressive interpretation of the law. So this memo says we ought to get up with him privately in advance of any ruling to inform him of his powers. So you got a written document urging a secret meeting with Sirica, clearly to lobby him in advance of something that's coming before him for decision. And then, son of a gun, on February 11th, Leon Jaworski meets with Judge Sirica, and his memo says, you know, I met yesterday with a judge, and as we sat alone in the jury room. And this is a 2-page memo, and it describes their discussions. And it's very clear, if you understand what's going on, that the judge was very reluctant to break grand jury secrecy and send this stuff. But Jaworski lobbied him and said, oh, but at least you should see the memo. You should hear us out on this. And ultimately, he convinces him. And so that's a second document that proves Jaworski's own hand, proves another ex parte meeting with Sirica. And then later on March 1st, this is when the indictments are handed down. And it's kind of a complicated situation because the indictments is the comprehensive Watergate cover-up indictment. And they're going to spring this roadmap, this secret report on everybody at the same time. So Jaworski writes a memo to his file that recounts how he slips into Judge Sirica's chambers in advance of the court hearing, and they actually rehearse how they're going to do it. And what's key in this rehearsal is trials are assigned by either rote or by a calendar committee based on which judges have available time. For the judge in the district at that time, for the chief judge, to take the case out of rotation, the prosecutors must ask for special handling. And Jaworski, in his memo, describes how he assured the judge he would request for special handling and when he would request it, so the judge could then name himself to preside over the Watergate cover-up trial. And then they go, the memo describes what happens in court that morning. And then after the hearing was over, the memo says we met again in his chambers at the conclusion of the hearing to evaluate how it had gone, and we agreed if stuff came up in the future, we'd get back in touch. So it's really 4 memos, but it's 3, well, 2 meetings before and after the hearing. Absolute, no question about it. Then about secret meetings. Then you've got other meetings. Phil Lacavara meets privately with Judge Gazelle, who was not only in that first meeting, but he's going to preside over the Plumbers prosecution. Now that's recorded. There's a memo by Lacavara also about a secret meeting with Judge the day after New Year's Day, where the judge had been to a New Year's Eve party, heard a rumor, and decided to call upon his private police, the Special Prosecution Unit, to check out this rumor. And Lacavara dutifully records that event. So these meetings are just dead wrong. I mean, there's just no justification whatsoever. If they had become public, then Judge Sirica and Judge Gazelle could not have presided over the trials, and the prosecutors involved could not have prosecuted. And if these people had been convicted, those convictions would have had to be vacated. It's open and shut. Now, they might have been retried, you understand. But just because the prosecutors cheated doesn't make the people innocent, but it means they didn't receive the due process of law guaranteed by our Constitution. Now, on September 15th, I've alluded to this before, but this is important. On September 15th, the Federalist Society sponsored a 3-hour symposium, and we had judges and law professors and practitioners go through these documents. And I mean, they were familiar with them. They heard my pitch. They didn't hear anybody else's, but they unanimously agreed that these trials couldn't be defended, and that if they were challenged, if the Department of Justice looked into them, they would have to vacate the verdicts. So you're right to ask about the ex parte meetings. It's amazing that the prosecutors wrote memos describing them, but there's no question they occurred.
Most of the time you see a document like that gets destroyed and you don't ever see a copy of it, or they don't write it down.
You got it. You wonder how these survive, because it's very clear the files were cleansed. There are allusions to other things and the memos aren't there. But you see what happened. That's what makes this thing so intriguing, Robbie. The Special Prosecutor's Office was created in May of 1973, and it grew to be 100 people, including 60 specially recruited lawyers, out to get Nixon. It didn't formally go out of business until June 1977, 4 years later. Plenty of time to clean out the files. But these 3 individuals, these 3 caches of documents that I've uncovered, they took with them because they left before the cover-up trial occurred. And it's interesting. I mean, you could speculate on why they did this, why they left before the trial, why they took their files with them, but they did. So their staff and the leftovers didn't have the opportunity to destroy these documents. It's possible, I mean, I've fretted over these documents for up to 8 years. It's possible as they grew older, they forgot what was there. I mean, if you went back through your life, certainly if I went back through mine, I would tell you I might have skated close to the edge, but pretty much I did the right thing. But if you had access to all of my thoughts, or if there was a tape recorder going on, you could say, well, that's not quite the way the record shows. And it's possible these people believed they hadn't done anything wrong. They were just getting along with a judge. But when you look at it afterwards, they were breaking far greater rules than the people they were accusing of conspiracy to cover up the crime.
Friends with a judge is one thing, but it's basically taught in law school that obviously these are things that can obviously not just be objects of mere speculation, but just the concept of this improper. You can't get to know, you can't have these back relationships. You're not supposed to meet this, even with someone hiring a lawyer as well too. So with the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial, she went to every single major lawyer in the area, so they wouldn't pick Johnny. She knew she wasn't going to pick any of them, but now they can't. There's a relationship there, so now you can't. And I mean,
They accuse, I'm not speaking as an expert, they accuse giant corporations of doing the same thing. They put the major law firms on retainer, or they ask them to handle some nondescript item, and it conflicts the firm out. So they can't be sued by big, powerful law firms.
it's a smart tactic.
Well, it
It's
sure
dirty.
is.
It's dirty.
You know, there are other professions where people get so involved, they want to win at any cost. Prosecutors are the same thing. They're human beings too, but there are rules. There are rules that the prosecution representing the federal government can't play win at any cost. It's written into our Fifth and Sixth Amendments to our Constitution, the due process of law. And for example, one is open and shut. If the prosecution, in putting its case together, comes across evidence that would be helpful to the defendant, they must turn that evidence over. This is called the Brady Rule from a Supreme Court decision, Brady v. Maryland. Well, I've come across memos, I've dug out memos that clearly contain what's called exculpatory evidence that would have helped the defendants. And the prosecutors knew they had those files and they did not turn them over to the defense. When the judges were warming up for this Federalist Society symposium I'm so thrilled with, one of the judges said, look, the ex parte meetings that you've proven raised the question of bias, that the judge was not independent or fair. But this suppression of exculpatory evidence is open and shut out of, it's not any question. This should have been turned over, and not turning this over is a huge due process violation. So he asked us to move that discussion up in the order of presentation of problems with the Watergate prosecutions. And it's the one he was most concerned with is a 26-page memo that describes the series of meetings the original prosecutors had with John Dean, who's the president's principal accuser. And when he first comes in, he meets with them 12 times. He or his lawyer, in person or by phone, meet with the career prosecutors 12 times during the month of April 1973, when he comes in looking for immunity. And this memo describes, meeting by meeting, his testimony changing to help prosecutors as he's trying desperately to get immunity. Now, this happens because the guys who are looking for immunity, they're willing to say anything if the prosecutors will just take care of them. In the end, in John Dean's case, the career prosecutors wouldn't grant him immunity. They decided he was not being forthcoming of his own role in the cover-up, and that he was too central, and they weren't going to grant immunity. But the documented changes in his testimony is an irrefutable example of evidence that would have been helpful to the defendants that wasn't turned over.
Why was there such a collaboration in trying to get Nixon out or trying to get Nixon guilty?
Well, Go back to his reelection. When he first wins in 1968, it was at that time among the very closest elections in our history. And the Democrats felt they'd only lost because of the massive opposition to the Vietnam War. I mean, they were just tearing this country apart. And that therefore Nixon was elected by fluke, and he wouldn't be reelected in 1972. And the guy who was going to take him out was Senator Edward Kennedy, the surviving Kennedy brother. Because Jack had been assassinated in 63, and Bobby, in 1968, Bobby was actually running for president when he was assassinated in Los Angeles. But that left one Kennedy brother, and they thought, boy, we can get back in control, restoration of Camelot. And then Teddy had this little problem in Chappaquiddick, where Mary Jo Kopechne drowned in the car that went off the bridge. And that prevented Ted Kennedy from running in 72. It's a wipeout of George McGovern. But the Kennedy people say, if we can cripple Nixon and use Watergate to cripple the Republican Party, we can run Teddy in 1976. And my first book, written in 2008, is titled The Secret Plot to Make Ted Kennedy President, because it traces everybody involved in Watergate attacking Nixon as being connected with a Kennedy political dynasty. Now, he didn't run in 76, and nobody's quite sure why. Then the first batch of documents from Leon Jaworski came out in 2013, and they formed the basis for my 2015 book, which is called The Real Watergate Scandal, which describes all the cheating that went on in the Watergate prosecutions. And my last book, my most recent book, which came out last November, about a year ago, is called The Nixon Conspiracy, because it's based on the unsealing of the roadmap that describes for the first time the prosecutors' falsehoods and misrepresentations made in secret to grand jurors and to congressional staff that accused Nixon personally of having approved the payment of blackmail. Turns out to be untrue. Turns out they couldn't prove it, but they made the accusation in secret. So Nixon's defense team, and remember, I was there, Nixon's defense team didn't know that's what he'd been accused of. Now, let me relate that just a little bit to today. Things have changed today. When Nixon was impeached back in 1974, 50 years ago, well, almost 50 years ago, there hadn't been an impeachment for 100 years. And it was generally conceded that in order to void Nixon's massive reelection, you'd have to show his personal criminality, personal engagement in an act that was the equivalent of bribery or treason, which is mentioned, crimes mentioned in the Constitution. Not something namby-pamby like, well, there was a conspiracy and one of the other guys did a break-in. They wanted to nail Nixon personally to get him impeached. And the special prosecutors said, we got it. We can prove that. We can prove Nixon personally approved the payment of blackmail. And we can tell you when he did it. We have it on tape. We can tell you exactly how it happened. It happened on March 21st, Wednesday, March 21st, 1973. What John Dean comes in and says, son of a gun, we're being blackmailed. And that meeting ends at noon. And son of a gun, at 10 o'clock that very night, there's a payment made to one of the Watergate burglars. I mean, what else could possibly be the explanation? And so they put this together. It's a complicated proof because it's circumstantial evidence. They postulate that what must have happened was after Dean leaves the meeting, because we have the tape, there's no agreement then. Nixon must have instructed Haldeman to call John Mitchell, Nixon's former attorney general, who was running the campaign. And he must have told Haldeman to tell Mitchell to make the payment. Mitchell must have called his associate, Fred LaRue, who had the money, because we know Fred made the payment at 10 o'clock that night. But there was a weakness. There was an event that didn't fit in the afternoon. They wanted it to, but it didn't fit, so they just lied about it. They just faked it. And that stayed sealed, because the roadmap stayed sealed, until 2018. But when the roadmap comes out, and it's a public document, it's posted online at the National Archives, you can go through. And my last book, The Nixon Conspiracy, walks you through where that little white lie occurred, which enabled them to claim in secret Nixon had personally approved the payment.
You were at the Watergate hearing?
No, I was employed on Nixon's Watergate defense team. The hearings, the Irvin Committee hearings, occurred in front of the Senate Select Committee. It was televised. I was watching just like everybody else in America. I knew everybody who was coming up to testify. In fact, there's a cute little part. Right, the second witness, when they opened, the first two witnesses were supposed to describe the names who were going to come up in the rest of the hearing. So the leadoff witness was the head of personnel for the president's reelection committee. The second witness was the staff secretary at the White House. So they would describe who these people were. And the second guy, Bruce Caroline, was describing the White House. And then they get to the first question. And one of the senators says, well, is there any Shepard on the White House staff? Because the name hadn't come up. Now, I'm Shepard. There was this guy, this messenger, who claimed he had records that impacted Watergate. And his lawyer had come into court saying, I represent an anonymous individual who needs court protection. And the White House had learned that this anonymous guy was named Shepard. It happened to be Roy Shepard. It wasn't me. But the senator thought he'd jump right into it and find out whether this mythical, mysterious Roy Shepard was on the staff. And Bruce Caroline, to my everlasting gratitude, he takes a sip of water, he puts the glass down, and he says, there's no Roy Shepard on the White House staff. And then the hearings went elsewhere, and I did not become notorious. And I continued to work on Nixon's defense team. Now, same thing with the two trials. The Plumbers trial occurred first, and then the Watergate cover-up trial. And it didn't go to either of them. I was fully employed as a member of Nixon and then Ford's White House staff. But because I was going to be a witness in each of those trials, I couldn't go in and listen to the trial. Remember I told you I transcribed the tapes. I also ran the document rooms that held the seized files of Haldeman and Ehrlichman and John Dean. And at one point, I was asked to take a particular memo from John Ehrlichman's files and give it to one of the special prosecutors. And then I wrote out an affidavit that that's what I had done. So for them to be able to introduce that memo in court, they had to show how it got to court, how it got to the special prosecutors. And I was what is called a chain of custody witness. I didn't know or care what the document said. I just had to say, yes, as my affidavit says, I took this out and I gave it to the prosecutors. So I actually appeared in the Plumbers trial. I was subpoenaed to be a witness, the same thing for the cover-up trial, because I'd handled the tapes. Now, I transcribed most of the tapes.
I got one big question for you on the tapes.
Yeah.
The
Well,
18
let me
minutes.
finish. Huh?
The 18
I
minutes.
get there. I get there.
Okay.
Um, let me back up just for a second, okay? Because I got a book here.
We're getting to that 18 minutes.
Okay. Does this come through right? Yes. This is called the Blue Book. And what we did on April 30th, 1974, we released all the transcripts. And I'm the one who certified these transcripts in the Blue Book. Okay. So those have been out in the public domain. What happened, and I was working from copies, you know, they didn't expose me to the original tapes. Those were locked up and eventually turned over to the prosecutors. But at the very end, Nixon had us look at a tape for the first time after the Supreme Court ruled the tapes had to be turned over, of June 23rd, 1972. And that became known as the smoking gun tape. It's where Nixon's staff, Haldeman, says the FBI wants to interview these people. We don't want them to interview the people. What we suggest is we get the CIA, tell the FBI those folks are part of one of their operations and they should leave them alone. And the president concurs. So open and shut proof of being involved in a conspiracy. When that tape surfaced, Nixon heard it first, but Fred was the first lawyer to listen to it. And then he asked me to prepare the transcript. So I'm the third person to hear the smoking gun tape. I prepared the original transcript, and I'm the one that called it the smoking gun. I mean, I'm the guy who did that. In this Blue Book, I'm the expletive deleter. I'm the one who pulled all the swear words. So I'm not a senior guy, you understand. I'm just a kid, but I'm there. I'm real close to what's going on. Well, when I did the transcription of the smoking gun tape, I was working from the original. We hadn't made a copy because we just learned that it existed. And I remember thinking, I'm sitting there, you know, the tape recorder's going, I'm back and forth trying to get the transcript. And I thought, you know, if this tape breaks, I'll never get out of jail. But it didn't, and I finished. So I had to be a witness in the cover-up trial, not because I pulled documents, but because I'd handled an original tape recording. Now, we come back, as you ask, what about the 18-minute gap? And for your viewers, we originally agreed to turn over the first 9 tapes. And when we went to turn them over, lawyers had never heard of them. Nixon wouldn't let his lawyers listen to them. He said they'd never be turned over, so it was a waste of our time. It turned out 2 didn't exist. One was a phone call done on a line in the residence that wasn't tapped, and the other was in Nixon's hideaway office, and the tape recorder had run out of tape. He was not expected to return to the office later that evening, and there wasn't enough tape, so the tape ran out, no recording. But then one of the other 7 turned out to have an 18-minute gap. And you're in the tape, it's the tape of June 20th. And 3 minutes, there's a buzz. And then for the next 15, the tone changes, but there's no words. This is the first time Haldeman is next to Nixon after the break-in. The break-in occurred, where they're caught red-handed, 3 days before. This is the first time they're in front of a tape recording. Haldeman's notes say Watergate. Nothing else. They just say Watergate. And there's this mystery. There's this missing 18-minute gap. And it caused quite a set too. And then it gets very complicated because everything in Watergate is very complicated. Bizarre discovered it, went immediately to the prosecutors and said, we got troubles. Somebody's messing with the tapes. If you'll indulge me, we can figure out together who it is and prosecute. But the special prosecutor says, no, 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 these are under subpoena. We must go tell Judge Sirica immediately that there's this gap. So Bazart goes to St. Clair's office. They leave St. Clair's office. They go to the Sirica's chambers. And Sirica says, this is really important. We have to have a hearing this afternoon. So they go right into the hearing. And of course, the only person who knows anything about the gap is Nixon's lawyer, Bazart. So he's the one that discovered it. He's the one that went to Jaworski to try to work out how to solve it, the mystery. And he ends up on the witness stand, and the prosecutors are cross-examining him like it was his fault. And he didn't have anything to do with it. Now, they appointed tape experts. They tried to find it. Even today, they don't know what happened. Rose Woods was doing the initial transcription of the tapes, and she went into Nixon and said, I made a big mistake. I answered the phone. I must have left it on reverse, but I wiped out 3 minutes of a conversation. And at the time, they thought that conversation wasn't one of the ones that had been subpoenaed. So they weren't particularly worried about it. And it was only 3 minutes. But then it turned out it was subpoenaed, and it was 18 minutes. And again, a huge cause célèbre. People who followed Watergate, they want to know, and there is no answer. Because it's the 50th anniversary, CNN did a series. CBS did. They all did a series. CBS did a review, and they asked Steve Bull. Steve was the president's personal assistant. He rigged up the tape recorder for Nixon to listen to certain tapes. And he said to them, he's telling me what he said to them, but he said, look, there are only 3 possibilities of people who touched that tape: Richard Nixon, his personal secretary, Rose Woods, and me. Now, they both passed away, and they denied it to their lying day. They did not erase the tape. And I'm telling you, I didn't erase it either. So he's telling me this story. I mean, this is within the last 3 months. And he said, Geoff, the funniest thing happened. After Nixon had resigned, I was out at San Clemente, where Nixon was, and there was this newspaper, and the newspaper had a front page story about a lady that ran a transcription service. And the way this worked was, if you were, I think it was dentists, but you'd call this number, and then you dictate your notes, and they'd be recorded, and then this lady's transcribers would transcribe your dictation, give it back to you for your files. And they kept dropping calls, and they kept having gaps. And they had out the tape recorder people, they had out the phone company, and they couldn't solve it. But ultimately, they concluded on that particular tape recorder, an Uhr 5000, if you jury rigged something on the recorder, not factory authorized, this is aftermarket, and they put a foot pedal on. I'm sorry, that's Rose's. The transcriber had rigged it so when the phone rang, the tape recorder started recording the telephone. And they discovered that instead of having to push reverse and delete, just reverse would wipe out the recording. Okay. So they brought this to the attention of the prosecutors. And the prosecutor said, Rose Woods has the same recorder. And they jury rigged the recorder to give her a foot pedal. So she'd go back and forth in transcribing, because you go back. I mean, I know that. I was doing the same thing, back and forth, trying to get the phrase right. And this is a front page story in the Orange County Register. Now, I said to Steve Bull, this is again our conversation 2 or 3 months ago, and then he said, I took the article back and gave it to the prosecutors who were hassling me about the 18-minute gap. And I said, this might be the answer. And they refused to accept the story. They said that book is closed. We're looking to prosecute, and we might prosecute you, but we don't care about your silly story. So I said to Steve, we got to find that. We got to find that article. And we found it. It's in September. It's front page of the Orange County Register. And recently I submitted it to the Department of Justice. It's on my website. It's published on my website. And I said, you know, there's been no other explanation coming forward for 40 years. Maybe this is true. I don't know. But the prosecutors never even agreed to look into it. So I leave this with you. The 18-minute gap is what was the phrase? A riddle wrapped in an enigma. We just don't know. The people who do know have all passed away. It's open and shut. 18 minutes is gone. Halden's notes say Watergate. The meeting was 3 days after the break-in. Don't know anything else.
Do you put any weight in the aspect that during Nixon's administration, he was pressuring a lot of people, and it just seemed like they all probably wanted him to take the blame on so much of everything? I mean, he was trying to start his own FBI. He was doing a lot of stuff after Hoover passed, and it seemed like there were overall people speaking out about his abuse. They said abuse of power, which would make
Well,
him a
there
target.
were lots and lots of allegations about his abuse of power. You know, today we use the phrase the deep state. If you go back to that era, the Democrats had been in control of everything. Massive majorities in the House and the Senate, control of the presidency since 1932, since the heart of the Depression. And it was only Nixon that challenged their dominance of our government. Now, Eisenhower was elected, but Eisenhower was a military hero. He could have run as a Democrat. He wasn't political. It was his vice president, Richard Nixon, who was political. And he had lots of enemies. We called it the Eastern liberal establishment. But they hated Dick Nixon from the time he took down Alger Hiss. And your viewers may not recognize the name, but Hiss was the epitome of the preppy Eastern ruling class. Harvard, State Department, head of this international organization for peace, the Carnegie Institute for Peace, clerked for Oliver Wendell Holmes, taught by Felix Frankfurter, and a communist during the early 1930s. Now, at the height of the Depression, there were lots of intellectuals who had lost faith in capitalism. Now, the world was depressed and thought maybe Karl Marx had a good idea with communism. And they flirted with it. And then it turned out that the reality of Joseph Stalin, nobody could stomach. So they just pretended that they hadn't done that. Well, Nixon caught Alger Hiss and pursued him. And Hiss, the statute of limitations had passed, but Hiss lied about his involvement and got convicted of perjury. And since the Soviet Union, it was big controversy. Everybody's, no, Nixon's wrong. Nixon's the bad guy in this. Hiss is our hero. But since the fall of the Soviet Union and we've had access to their files, Hiss is in there. They got a code name for him and everything else. So from that moment on, Nixon is hated by the Eastern establishment. And then he takes out Helen Gahagan Douglas, a Hollywood starlet who was running for Senate, and he beats her badly. Then he becomes Eisenhower's vice president. And they, I mean, you talk about hatred. They just hated him. And he relished it. He thought editorials against him, attacking his views, built his constituency because he was the anti-establishment. Now, part of the impeachment process, because there were 3 articles of impeachment. One was the cover-up. He was a co-conspirator. Second, that was Article 1. Second article was abuses of power. You've been president for 5 years. You've disagreed with the Congress. And we think those abuses are grounds to impeach you. And there was a whole series of things. The wiretaps on the National Security Council people done without court authorization. He refused to spend money. It was called, well, forget what it's called. We've allocated money for new submarine and you won't spend it. And that's you don't have that authority. The midnight bombing of Cambodia. You're doing stuff we haven't authorized. And so there is a article titled Abuses of Power. The plumber's break-in. The plumber's break-in was done without court authority. Hillary Clinton was a young staffer on the House Judiciary Committee, and the Republicans kept asking for a comparison of allegations against Nixon to allegations against his predecessors, because Congress always tangles with the executive branch. So Hillary was charged with conducting a study of what happened with other presidents. And the study was done by a guy named C. Van Woodward at Yale, head of the history department. And he got 5 other history professors to go all the way back and look and see what had happened before. And the study showed that what Nixon was accused of by the Congress was not dramatically dissimilar from allegations made against his predecessors because of this tension, the checks and balances built into our system of government. So they didn't share the study with the Congress. They suppressed it. And they just said, no, well, that's too bad. We don't have that. But the professors were so thrilled with their study that they published it as a book after Nixon had resigned. So indulge me for a moment. Happen to have the book right here.
Yeah, a lot of books.
Okay. Responses of the presidents to charges of misconduct all the way back from Nixon to George Washington. Okay. And this was suppressed, and this came out afterwards. Now, your allegation you wanted to set a secret police, that was the plumbers. That was trying to stop government leaks that were a national security concern. When those Pentagon papers leaked, that was considered to be the biggest national security breach since the Cold War. And they felt people were losing their lives because of materials that Daniel Ellsberg had leaked, and the New York Times and the Washington Post were gleefully printing. So they did establish this unit within the White House to ferret that out, to stop leaks. It really gets peculiar, you know. The more you learn about Watergate, the stranger it gets. Hoover should have been running. Hoover's FBI should have been running this stuff, but he didn't want to. He was worried that the FBI might be embarrassed. And Daniel Ellsberg's father-in-law, a guy named Lewis Marks, was a really good friend of Hoover's. He ran a toy company, and he gave hundreds of toys to Hoover at Christmas time.
Is that Hasbro?
FBI officers to give away to less fortunate people. So Hoover didn't want to rock the boat. And of course, Nixon is going crazy.
Is that
because
Hasbro?
of these leaks.
Is that Hasbro?
I don't know what it was. It might well have been, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Well, there's a
I'm
relationship
certain of
with
the name, but not the company.
There's a relationship with a toy company where they made a thing called Devil Eyes, I think it is. You can look it up on Wikipedia, but it was used in, this is later days, but it was used during the Iraq War. What they would do is they would send these little toy soldier type things. They'd be like terrorists, basically, little toy terrorists, and they would have this translucent paint that's on their face, and when light hits it, it would show a face of like a devil, and it was it was a brainwashing tactic. Yeah, you can look that up.
My goodness. Now, what's intriguing, because we're on the plumbers now, just for a second. The plumbers broke into Dr. Lewis Fielding's office without court authority. And it was under the Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable search and seizure. It turns out, and this came out a year after Nixon had resigned, a thing called the Church Committee that investigated abuses in domestic intelligence, that for the previous 40 years, the FBI, the CIA, and military intelligence units had routinely broken into the homes and offices of American citizens without benefit of a warrant, under the idea that the president, as commander-in-chief, had an obligation to protect the national security of the United States, which rendered those intrusions to not be unreasonable. So the way you summarize that is there a national security defense to a Fourth Amendment violation? And for the previous 40 years, the Church Committee published a book about it, and they published let me stand up for just a second. Here's their report. This comes out in 1976, but it documents hundreds and hundreds of black bag jobs. That was the FBI's name, or surreptitious entries. That was the CIA's name for these operations. So it's not a secret police. This was a group trying to ferret out leakers. Well, Washington has always leaked. The administration is always upset about leaks. Obama tapped James Rosen's phone over leaks, and the phones of his parents. And nobody seemed to get extraordinarily upset about that. But under Nixon, this was a capital offense.
There's so much complication to this story. It makes it really hard to get the historical record straight, especially when documents take forever to come out. I mean, Kennedy assassination happened almost 60 years ago, and there's still people fighting over new document releases. They're still keeping documents as well,
Even today, they have not released the last of the Kennedy assassinations. Now, one of the guys at National Archives working on that used to be the National Archives expert on the Nixon tapes, so I know him. And he was doing some of the Kennedy stuff. And I said, look, if you run into anything you think I might be interested in, I got nothing to do with Kennedy, let me know so I don't have to wade through all this stuff. And he did. They found out something that they released. This is 5 years ago. It turned out, now Howard Hunt is one of the plumbers and one of the Watergate masterminds,
and involved in Cuba.
He's much older than Gordon Liddy. He's a career CIA agent and retired from the agency, but he went to work as a consultant at the White House. He also wrote about 45 novels under various pseudonyms where the CIA came out looking pretty good. CIA was heroes in the novels. And one of the CIA's problems is you never hear about their successes, but you sure read about their failures. So Richard Helms was head of the CIA, Johnson, and then under Nixon. And what they found in these Kennedy papers, of all things, was a series of reports by a CIA executive looking into whether Richard Helms had given money to Howard Hunt in support of his writing these novels because they made the CIA look good. And that might, in the wrong hands, that information might have led to an accusation that the CIA was really running Howard Hunt when he did the plumbers break-in and then the Watergate break-in. So this is just this guy's reports, and they can't find it. Okay, they're worried there's a paper trail, but you know the CIA doesn't keep a lot of written records. And the funny thing, I mean, the director of the CIA had a lot of discretion on how money was spent. Money was allocated and money was spent. It doesn't go anywhere. I mean, there's no finding after that. But it shows you how intriguing these things can become when you get into really deep state stuff. You know, you got allegations today that the FBI is cutting corners. We didn't have those in Watergate. We have allegations that the Department of Justice prosecutors were cutting corners. And judges were cutting corners. You know, who knows what we'll know in 50 years? I mean, what astonishes me almost on a daily basis is these folks left a paper trail. Why would you ever write down about a secret meeting you had with a judge? Or why would that survive? Okay, I mean, you know, supposedly this letter, the one I started with, the letter of December 27th, there should be a copy in Sirica's files. He got it. There isn't. There should be a copy in other people's files because they were copied on the letter. They're not. The only place that survived was the set of confidential files Leon Jaworski took with him when he left early, when he resigned before the cover-up prosecution. Now, you know, and then you can go crazy. Why did he take those files? Because he wanted to write a book, because he wanted to someday disclose that he didn't want to be a part of that prosecution because he knows it was wrong, to protect himself from accusations by others. It's the same question of why Nixon didn't destroy the tapes. I mean, he must have known what was on the tapes. He was there. And yet, he told Haig that he didn't destroy the tapes because he thought in the last analysis they would prove that he was not guilty. There was another theory that he was so far removed from the actual system that he couldn't be sure whatever he destroyed was the tapes or was all of the tapes or whether there was another set. When they put in the recording system, which was super secret, they put it in 2 years into his presidency, goes in February of 1971. They stopped taking extensive notes about meetings he was involved in because they were on tape. And the theory was nobody else would ever know about them, nobody else would ever listen. But if he was trying to remind himself of a word or a phrase or a particular date, he could listen to the tape, and that would facilitate the accuracy of the books he planned on writing when he left the White House. Ike wrote a book or two, and that's how he supported himself, having left the White House. Nixon wasn't going to go join a board or go to work. His idea was to write books, and in fact, he wrote nine or 10 of them after he left office. And the tapes were kind of like his pension, you know, they're your notes so you can write better books. And destroying the tapes was destroying files that would have helped him to do a better job on his books. But who knows? Because Uh, Shortly after they became public, they fell under subpoena, and then he decided he wasn't gonna destroy them.
Well, I'm gonna avoid speculation and theorizing because it just angers me that I don't have the real answer to anything on that.
Well, because of the tapes, because they weren't destroyed, Nixon's is the best documented presidency in history. Nobody else has tapes, and nobody else is going to make them. And I wish that he had destroyed them. I really do. I've spent hundreds of hours transcribing them. They're like the Bible. You can take anything out of context and prove anything you want.
Wait till he talks about Bohemian Grove. That's the funniest thing to me that he's calling out all these elites. That's hilarious.
He doesn't like them.
I don't,
He does
he
not like.
mentioned it and he said it in some pretty colorful language that would not fit
Yeah,
today either.
yeah. He's born in the proverbial log cabin. I mean, his biography starts out, "I was born in the house my father built in 1913," and it still stands. It's on the site where his library is. But there were 300 people in Yorba Linda when he was born. I mean, it was really the sticks, and he comes from nowhere. I mean, he's not Ivy League. He's not preppy. He's not wealthy. Uh, uh, he he uh, he brings himself up by his bootstraps. And what I discovered later, which is really intriguing, he did so well in high school. He won the Republican scholarship from Orange County to go to Harvard, a full scholarship. But his parents couldn't spare him from the little grocery store. He used to get up and go downtown LA at 4 a.m. every morning to buy fresh fruit and produce to come back and sell at their store. And they couldn't replace him. He worked for free. So he couldn't go to Harvard. So all the time, these other people, and all the Ivy League, all the prestige, all the Eastern schools are dumping all over him. He knew, but for his family's poverty, but for the Great Depression, he could have gone to Harvard too.
Well, Mr. Shepard, I appreciate the time you've given me to talk about Watergate and some of your work as well too. Is there a place where people can find your links and any other websites, social media, anything?
Absolutely. Thank you, Robbie. Uh, my website is designed to help other people do research and answer questions. And it's www.shepardonwatergate.com. And Shepard is spelled funny. It's Shepard. Shepardonwatergate.com. I've got all my books, links to all these documents I've been talking about, all the essays, all the presentations, and particularly under news, the top entry is that September 15th symposium. If you want scholarly analysis of what these prosecutors did, that's where you'll find it.
Well, I'm going to link all your links in the description. Seriously, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. You're welcome back anytime. And thanks everyone for listening to this episode of How to the